Everybody. We will resume our consultations now. So we have a number of more speakers on Part A, Section 1, and inevitably, some of the statements this morning have, of course, been included general statements on the issue, and a number of states have said that they will come back with more specific comments on this section before the end of this section, so we will do that. So I would just make the point that if anyone has any proposals or comments or suggestions in relation to Section 1, please make sure to make your intervention in this section before we move then to Section 2. So we're going to continue now, and we will pick up the speakers list where we left it, and I'm going to give the floor now next to the Republic of Korea, who will be followed by Human Rights Watch. So Republic of Korea, you have the floor now.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm grateful to you, Mr. Chairperson, and your team for convening this important meeting with good progress. Indeed, WIPA is one of the most relevant issues related to disarmament and security at this moment, as evidenced by Russia's armed invasion against Ukraine and its humanitarian consequences. My country shares the view that there is urgent need to consider and take necessary measures in this endeavor. That said, my country has difficulty with fully supporting the text in front of us, particularly due to the scope in the title, as well as several parts in the main text. It is a matter on how broadly and adequately we get to define and regulate explosive weapons. My delegation views that the current drafting is too broad and too vague. As already indicated by several delegations in the morning, extensive support from many countries will be important for this declaration to be politically and operationally meaningful. In this regard, the scope needs to be readjusted in a more reasonable and realistic manner by reflecting due considerations and concerns of several countries. My country supports the idea of Turkish delegation of adding a qualifier such as indiscriminate or unlawful in front of use of WIPA, explosive weapons in populated areas, in the title and relevant parts in the main text, if not all. Thus, it will be read as indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas or unlawful use of explosive weapons in populated areas. It is natural that even discriminates or lawful use of explosive weapons in accordance with international humanitarian laws can significantly lower the humanitarian consequences that we are concerned most and trying to cover under this declaration. Finally, the addition of a new paragraph 1.8 concerning non-creation of additional obligations proposed by Turkey is an idea that we could consider, as it is useful in clarifying the intention of this declaration and addressing due concerns of countries. I thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Human Rights Watch, to be followed by the Danish Refugee Council. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson. The current draft declaration has incorporated many of the changes we previously recommended, and we welcome and appreciated your continued work on the text. Section 1 of the draft more accurately reflects the gravity of the harm suffered by civilians and emphasizes the need for the commitments listed in Sections 3 and 4. It should further be refined, however, including by sharpening its descriptions of the different types of harm caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and by expanding its data collection and sharing paragraph. While the qualifier "can" was appropriately deleted in most places, including the title, it still unnecessarily weakens references to well-documented civilian impacts of explosive weapons, including psychological, psychosocial, and environmental harm. The word should be removed in the relevant places in paragraphs 1.2 and 1.3. Also in paragraph 1.2, the phrase blast, debris, and fragmentation effects should be amended because debris, while hazardous to civilians, is not an effect in itself. The sentence could be rewritten as blast and fragmentation effects and resulting debris cause. We recommend that section 1 of the declaration insert a new paragraph addressing the concept of wide area effects. The phrase wide area effects was correctly removed from most of the declaration. Victim assistance, for example, should be provided to those affected by the use of all explosive weapons in populated areas. But the phrase is important for paragraph 3.3 in the operative section of the declaration, which should include a commitment to avoid the use of the subset of explosive weapons that is most dangerous. The new paragraph should recognize that explosive weapons with wide area effects exacerbates the harm to civilians and clearly describe wide area effects. It should state that weapons have wide area effects if they, 1, have a wide blast and fragmentation radius, 2, are inaccurate, 3, deliver multiple munitions at once, or have a combination of those factors. In paragraph 1.4 and section 3, the term unexploded ordnance should be replaced with a broader term, explosive ordnance, which also captures mined and improvised explosive devices. It should also be noted that explosive ordnance causes harm during as well as long after hostilities have ended. In paragraph 1.6, we welcome the inclusion of a reference to tracking civilian casualties in addition to recording them. Tracking suggests monitoring harm and analyzing patterns in real time rather than simply capturing total casualty numbers at a single moment. The paragraph should be strengthened, however, by removing its superfluous caveats such as where feasible. In addition, it should recognize the need to collect and share data on the range of civilian impacts, including harm to civilian objects, as well as on the specifics of operational use of explosive weapons in populated areas, such as the types and numbers of weapons used, locations and intended targets, and the circumstances of use. Finally, we recommend that in paragraph 1.7, short and long-term humanitarian consequences be amended to, quote, direct and reverberating effects, to be parallel with other parts of the declaration. In general, the new draft better distinguishes between different categories of harm, referring to direct effects, which are caused at the time of attack, and indirect, also known as reverberating effects, which it describes as being, quote, severe and long-lasting. While Human Rights Watch, INU, and others have seen value in a more nuanced three-tier distinction, what matters most is that the declaration addresses the harm comprehensively and consistently. It generally does so, but this paragraph is one place where it uses different terms. We have provided more specific comments on other paragraphs in our written submission. Thank you. Is the thing not working?
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to the Danish Refugee Council, to be followed by Ecuador. You have the floor.
As a member of the International Network on Explosive Weapons, INU, the Danish Refugee Council fully supports the commentary submitted by INU, and for the sake of brevity and the focus on the preamble, section 1, we'll keep this and take the floor very briefly now. Firstly, we want to express our deepest appreciation for the efforts made by the Government of Ireland to foster the development and the adoption of a political declaration aimed at strengthening the protection of civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. While currently operating in over 15 countries and engaging in clearance activities affected by conflict, DRC has evidenced the extreme impact IWIPA has had on human suffering, ranging from the high levels of casualties, the destruction of life-saving and other essential civilian infrastructure, to the longer-term physical and psychological impact on entire neighborhoods contaminated with unexploded ordnance. As an organization whose mandate focuses on the rights of the displaced populations, which includes refugees and IDPs, we feel that we must emphasize how the use of IWIPA forces people to flee and impedes their safe return. The use of IWIPA contributes to protracted displacement, hinders spontaneous recovery amongst affected populations, including host and receiving communities, and can allow for renewed displacement. This is the reason why, regarding input to the political declaration, in addition to the INU commentary, we deem that there should be more emphasis on the displacement caused during and following the use of IWIPA, as well as the connected challenges that ensue. Therefore, we'd like to see a reference made in the text to the specific challenges faced by internally displaced populations and refugees as a consequence of IWIPA, including the social, economic, legal, physical, and psychological impact, alongside the risks attributed to displacement. We've submitted a written submission to reword Article 1.4 in the current political declaration in support of this. We hope that with this and the outcome of this effort, we will strengthen the protection of civilians in and because of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor now to Ecuador, to be followed by the Conflict and Environment Observatory. But Ecuador, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Thank you very much, Chair. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate you and Ireland for your leadership on this very important issue. Now, the pandemic has set back the negotiation of this political declaration, but it has not undermined its importance. The importance of strengthening the protection of civilians against the humanitarian impact caused by explosive devices in populated areas is more than evident these days. We recognize your ongoing efforts to achieve the best possible consensus on this document and would like to thank you for the last version that was circulated. We believe that it has some significant improvements and it is a very good draft document that we can use in our work. In this respect, my delegation would like to highlight one point in terms of the use, for example, of the explosive weapons in popular areas, using this term without any limitations. And perhaps maybe we can accept certain limitations in different parts of the text, for example, like paragraph 3.3, but we do not find it adequate to use it in such general terms. Now, there are also indirect or direct effects of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and we should harmonize the uses of this language throughout text, and also this will help improve assistance to victims. But in order to follow your advice, we'd like to be more specific in our comments, going section by section, and we would like to simply focus on the most important points. The title of section 1. Now, the title of the declaration, we appreciate the fact that our suggestion and suggestion of other delegations was taken into account, and we support the current text that reflects the objectives. Now, on paragraphs 1.1 and 1.2, we have seen some improvements in comparison to the previous text. Nevertheless, in 1.2, would like to suggest the inclusion the psychological and psychosocial damage that may be caused by these weapons. Now, on the new paragraph 1.5, which was previously 1.6, we believe that this paragraph would better belong in section 4, related to issues of best practices. And we can improve the language of this text because one of the central objectives of declaration is the reflection of the concerns related to the humanitarian consequences of use of such weapons. And we can change the language to say that military staff should use practices to avoid damage to civilians and civilian objects, and they should be aware of the effects of explosive devices and the risk that this may have for civilians in populated areas, something that was suggested by the ICRC. And also, this paragraph will not only improve the application of IHL, but also it'll help improve the situation of civilians in situations when such weapons are used. And I'll refer to other sections later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is the Conflict and Environment Observatory, to be followed by Panama. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and our thanks to the Government of Ireland for its work in developing and promoting this political declaration. I'm delivering this intervention on behalf of the Conflict and Environment Observatory, Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic, Norwegian People Aid, PAX, WILF and Zoe Environment Network. Our organisations all work in the field of environmental risks resulting from conflicts either in research, advocacy or explosive ordnance clearance operations. We urge states to ensure that the declaration properly addresses the environmental risks created by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and we wish to explain the need to properly integrate measures to protect the environment when dealing with their legacy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has underscored the horrendous impact on civilians from the use of explosive weapons in towns and cities. Research by non-governmental organisations has highlighted the serious environmental risks associated with the use of explosive weapons, particularly where residential areas are commingled with industrial, commercial and energy infrastructure. Independent monitoring of the conflict has already identified dozens of locations where damage from explosive weapons may have caused serious pollution incidents that may affect communities for long after the conflict. Unfortunately, these risks are not unique to Ukraine. These risks are an inevitable outcome of the decision to deploy explosive weapons in populated areas, as we have seen from conflicts in Syria, Iraq and elsewhere. We stress the importance of strengthening the declaration text to protect citizens against the grave, direct, indirect and reverberating effects from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We therefore align ourselves with the comments made by INU to strengthen the political declaration as to better protect civilians against the impact of this practice. In this statement, we offer further detail on the links between the use of explosive weapons and environmental damage. Our goal is to ensure that the environmental consequences of the use of explosive weapons are well understood and reflected in the political declaration. These consequences include acute and chronic health risks to the civilian population and the long-term degradation of the environment. We would like to clarify the following. The environment is a civilian object. Protecting the environment and the services it provides is a vital component of protection of civilians. The environmental contamination linked to the use of explosive weapons poses acute and chronic health risks to civilians. The use of explosive weapons is of particular environmental concern due to the destruction or damage it causes to infrastructure and objects found in populated areas. This destruction or damage can lead to pollution of environmental media and create immediate and long-term exposure risks for civilians. The debris generated by the intense use of explosive weapons in populated areas can create environmental health risks and, if improperly managed, lingering damage to the environment. We therefore ask states to consider the following. We encourage states to replace the term natural environment with the term environment. Although the term natural environment is used in Additional Protocol 1, it is an artifact of the period of its development and does not reflect contemporary understanding of the relationship between people and the environment, nor of the value of the environment per se. Furthermore, we encourage states to facilitate the work of the United Nations, the ICRC, other relevant international organisations and civil society organisations aimed at protecting and assisting civilian populations and addressing the direct and indirect humanitarian and environmental impact arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The political declaration should therefore also include a recommendation to collect data on the environmental effects from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We encourage states to include the environment in Article 4.2, namely to collect and, where feasible and practical, share and make publicly available disaggregated data on the direct and reverberating effects on civilians and on the environment of military operations involving the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Panama, to be followed by the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict. Panama, you have the floor.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Chair. On behalf of my delegation, I'd like to congratulate you on your leadership in this process of consultations with a view of adopting a political declaration to deal with the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We do hope that the dynamics of this process will not lose its open and transparent nature in order to ensure full respect of international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law. And this is why we support all initiatives to put an end to the devastating impact on the use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas, something that is the main cause of the deaths and wounds to civilian populations, affecting especially women, children, persons with disabilities, and the elderly. We welcome the broad support that the renewal of this process has enjoyed, especially in light of the most recent events in Europe. For my delegation, it is of crucial importance to ensure that this process is comprehensive in its nature, taking into account the fact that over decades, the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas has led to the suffering of civilians in various parts of the world. This violation of international law should be strongly condemned by the international community, regardless of where this is taking place, what are the circumstances, who is responsible for these acts. Panama has taken efforts to include a language related to the use of explosive weapons in populated areas in resolutions on country situations that are in contexts of armed conflicts. But we unfortunately did not have any success in our efforts. But we still remain optimistic that the impetus that we have seen this morning will be reproduced in other UN forums. Now, Chairman, we thank Ireland for the presentation of the second version of the political declaration, and we welcome the different proposals of Panama, the fact that the different proposals of Panama have been reflected here. And we'd like to highlight some aspects that we believe are necessary to strengthen the text. We will be limiting ourselves to some issues, and we'll be sending you some other proposals in writing. And also we have seen that different organizations, the ICRC, the Environment Observatory, and Human Rights Watch have presented very important proposals. We believe that in paragraph 1, we should have a reference to the psychological and psychosocial impact, something that we now find in paragraph 1.3. We believe that this is part of the direct effect of the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas. And also in the same paragraph, and also in 1.2, we do hope that we can delete some words that we have already referred to when we are talking about that may have a negative effect. And I think the word can appears twice, and we should delete one of them. In 1.3, we support what was mentioned by other delegations to talk about not only destruction but also damage, and also include references to hospitals, transport infrastructure, communication infrastructure. And also in this paragraph, it will be also relevant to have a reference to make a reference to the impact of unexploded ordnance. Now, on paragraph 1.4, we'd like to see a reference here to say that these effects not only lead to displacement, but also they impede safe and sustainable return of displaced persons. And also, it not only has an impact on SDGs, but on the full enjoyment of human rights. Would like to add that. Now, on 1.6, when we refer to disaggregated data, instead of talking about sex, we should talk about gender, and also include a reference to disabilities. And we have seen that there's a reference in different parts of the text, a reference there, but we have to remember that this group of the population very often remains invisible in armed conflicts, and we have to include, when we talk about disaggregated data, to refer to disabled persons. And also target 17.18 of the SDGs talks about that. So these are my comments for the time being, but we'll be sending also our comments in writing and will actively participate in our future sessions.
Very much. After Panama, next on the list is the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict, to be followed by the Holy See. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Gaffey. On behalf of Civic, we commend Ireland's tireless leadership on the political declaration process. The latest draft has been strengthened in a number of areas to more clearly describe the harm caused when explosive weapons are used in towns and cities, and outlines commitments by states to strengthen protection of civilians when armed conflict takes place in urban areas. We support recommendations made by INU to strengthen the political declaration. Civic has offered additional comments based on our operational work in Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Syria, Sahel, Somalia, and Ukraine, engaging with national militaries and coalitions on practices, policies, and training on civilian harm mitigation. We have submitted comments on section 1.1 to 1.7, but at this time I would like to offer remarks on a couple of areas. Civic recommends inserting language acknowledging that explosive weapons with wide area effects be added in the preamble to highlight the particular correlation between wide area effects and risk of civilian harm. The risks are increased when weapons have an impact that extend beyond the military objective due to the large destructive radius, inaccuracy, or because they are designed to fire multiple munitions simultaneously over a wide area. This amendment would better relate to language in 3.3, where there's a recognition of weapons whose effects extend beyond the military objective. Civic welcomes paragraph 1.5 to highlight the scope of improvement in policies and practices. We recommend acknowledging that some militaries, and not many, have enacted policies and practices, but that much more is needed to implement those policies and practices and improve measures to strengthen protection norms. We also recommend adding language that good practices be shared as part of security assistance and partnered operations, as many militaries are engaged in coalitions or provide security assistance to a party to conflict. Civic recommends additional language in para 1.6 on tracking of civilian harm by militaries to reflect on the utility of this tool and its effectiveness. Based on our experience having created such mechanisms for militaries in Afghanistan and Ukraine, and with multinational forces such as AMISOM and the G5 Sahel, and engaging with coalitions operating in Iraq and Syria, such a tracking tool works more effectively when a military or multinational forces tracking is supplemented by information recorded from outside the military by NGOs or the UN. This allows for more comprehensive analysis of all possible incidents and remedial measures to mitigate civilian harm and to avoid the challenges we see with self-reporting by the military. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the list is the Holy See, to be followed by Canada, but the representative of the Holy See has the floor now.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Mr. Chairperson. Before delving into specific comments, please allow me to express the gratitude of the Holy See to Ireland for its leadership on this important and all the more necessary political declaration. As a general comment, let me be clear that the participation of the Holy See in this process originates from its firm conviction of the fundamentally inhumane and cruel nature of all conflicts. It is a fact that conventional weapons are truly becoming less and less conventional, and more weapons of mass displacement, as their destructive power and sophistication is able to devastate entire cities, schools, hospitals, infrastructures, and services essential to the population. Regrettably, that minimum protection of the dignity of every person, which ought to be guaranteed with great vigilance through the dutiful implementation of international instruments, is all too often violated in the name of military or political demands. Violent and prolonged conflict persist, increase, and worsen. Atrocities and grave offenses against the dignity of the human person are being perpetrated in the name of military and political demands. In this regard, by participating in this process, the Holy See intends to renew its encouragement and support other states to take all feasible possible measures to prevent and mitigate the negative consequences of hostilities. Mr. Chairperson, going into specific comments on Section 1, the Holy See welcomes the improvements made since the previous draft and welcomes the recognition that the risks to civilians have increased
and that this is a source of major concern that must be addressed. In our view, it is crucial to place the human person, and in particular past, present, and future victims, at the center of concerns. In fact, a tragic reality is that throughout history, all conflicts have been ostensibly justified, and this has resulted in the suffering of civilians. Regarding paragraph 1.3, we have a specific drafting suggestion. It is a fact that modern armed conflicts cause physical and psychological suffering, but at the same time, there is an important spiritual dimension. In this regard, this delegation wishes to replace the expression cultural heritage sites with a broader reference that includes a specific reference to places of worship. Therefore, we suggest redrafting the beginning of the paragraph as follows. The destruction of housing, schools, hospitals, and healthcare facilities, as well as that of historic monuments, works of art, and places of worship, which constitute the cultural spiritual heritage of peoples, further aggravates, and so on. This terminology is agreed language taken from Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions, namely Article 53 and Article 85, paragraph 4D. With reference to paragraph 1.5, we welcome the addition of the expression avoid and in any event minimize in place of mitigate, and the addition of universal before implementation. Indeed, we agree with what has been said by other delegations that this declaration will be only as effective as it is universal. With reference to paragraph 1.7, the Holy See appreciates the added emphasis on the imperative of addressing the short and long-term humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons, as this implies a reference to the civilians, which are the ones who suffer the most from the ravages of war. With reference to what is now paragraph 1.7 bis, this delegation believes that research should remain general, focusing on the impact of explosive weapons on everyone who is affected, including women and girls. In this regard, we have concerns regarding the use of the expression gendered impacts, which is not an agreed term under IHL. In our view, for a political declaration whose title is Strengthening the Protection of Civilians from the Humanitarian Consequences Arising from the Use of Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, to focus solely on gendered impacts is very limiting. For us, the keywords are protection and populated areas. Therefore, to capture the need to focus on everyone, in particular those in populated areas, we propose to rephrase the last part of this paragraph by adding a specific reference to local communities and urban populations. The last part of paragraph 1.7 bis would read as follows. And we encourage further research into the impact of the use of explosive weapons, especially on local communities and urban populations. We will be happy to submit the specific textual proposals in written format. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Throughout this meeting to engage constructively. Mr. Chair, Canada appreciates amendments incorporated in the newest draft, particularly in recognition of the different and gendered impacts of armed conflict. We also greatly appreciate Ireland's efforts to place the protection of civilians at the center of its UN Security Council tenure and to highlight its importance throughout this consultation process. From the outset of negotiations, Canada has called on the political declaration to be civilian-centered and for it to acknowledge the broader humanitarian and protection impacts of armed conflict in populated areas. Mr. Chair, Canada unequivocally condemns Russia's blatant aggression in Ukraine, which is a violation of the UN Charter. The current humanitarian crisis in Ukraine resulting from the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure and the siege of cities serves to highlight the need for parties to armed conflict to comply with international humanitarian law governing the conduct of hostilities. In this context, it seems important in this forum to distinguish between UN Charter violations and the purely humanitarian domain protected by international humanitarian law. We believe efforts in this forum should focus on protecting the integrity of both IHL and the humanitarian space. The declaration should avoid creating false equivalencies, where a state lawfully using explosive weapons in populated areas is subject to the same criticism as states that deliberately shirk their IHL obligations and unlawfully use weapons against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Indeed, the humanitarian crisis resulting from modern armed conflict would be mitigated were parties to successfully integrate that universally binding body of law into the planning and execution of their military operations, and hold violators to account through appropriate national mechanisms. Canada's view is that the Declaration's value in protecting civilians lies in reaffirming our existing international humanitarian law obligations while actively promoting their effective national implementation. As such, the current draft, there are still paragraphs of which we maintain strong reservations. Our main strong concerns focus on paragraph 3.3, which creates a new standard regarding the use of weapons that we do not support. Recognizing that the intent of this operative paragraph and the broader declaration is to help strengthen the protection of civilians during urban warfare, we would like to recall that attacks that cannot be directed at civilian populations or objects, and that the rule of proportionality permits attacks to have incidental effects on collateral objects and people, as long as those effects are not excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage. We believe that the principle of proportionality as defined in IHL needs to be reflected adequately in the political declaration. We would welcome other formulations that would reinforce existing IHL obligations. Now recalling and building upon Canada's previous language proposals, we would like to comment on two specific paragraphs in Section 1 of the draft declaration. We also intend to provide written comments following this meeting. Firstly, with regards to the title and references to explosive weapons in populated areas in 1.1, we would like to stress that IHL permits the lawful use of weapons by parties to an armed conflict. All weapons that appropriately discriminate between combatants and the civilian population and between military objectives and civilian objects are lawful. Improved IHL compliance by parties to a conflict can reduce the indiscriminate and targeted attacks on civilians and civilian objects, thereby limiting civilian harm. Therefore, as expressed by the delegations of Turkey and the Republic of Korea, Canada would similarly like to propose the insertion of indiscriminate wherever the term use of explosive weapons in populated areas or other variations are retained throughout the declaration. This qualifier would more effectively differentiate between lawful and unlawful uses of weapons and better align this language to international law. Secondly, the term reverberating effects used throughout the text, including in paragraph 1.2, is not defined in international law. IHL prohibits indiscriminate attacks that employ weapons or methods of warfare that cannot be directed at a specific military objective or whose effects cannot be sufficiently limited. Attacks that are not expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, are lawful. As such, in the third sentence of paragraph 1.2, we propose to replace the words indirect effects, also referred to as reverberating effects, by the word harm. This would accurately reflect the principle of proportionality as defined in IHL. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I next give the floor to Peru, to be followed by Indonesia. Peru, you have the floor.
Ambassador, good afternoon. We're pleased to meet once again to continue our work on a political declaration related to the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And we thank Ireland for its leadership in these humanitarian processes. And we thank Ireland for providing funding for interpretation services that helps us promote multilingualism. This issue is a priority for Peru, and this is something that we have been promoting in different international forums, questions of disarmament and maintaining peace and security. This is not a new issue. On the contrary, we see that more and more often civilians become victims during armed conflicts, and the devastating events in Ukraine once again call the attention of the international community to look at this issue and at other conflicts that have been taking place over the past decades and are taking place now. Now, Ambassador, on the revised text, and as you have requested us, we'll focus on Section 1. We find that this is a significant improvement of the text in comparison to the initial version, that helps us work together on issues related to the implementation of IHL in order to protect civilians better in armed conflicts. And in this respect, we favor the clear and specific reaffirmation in the text that the political declaration has IHL as the fundamental legal reference point. And also, the text preserves the focus on the use of explosive weapons in highly densely populated areas and on the long and short-term humanitarian effects. Now, the characterization of the problem, we welcome the fact that the text now has a better definition of the impact of explosive weapons, including direct, indirect, and reverberating effects. We welcome the reference to the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda, because that is the most important roadmap in questions of development of nations, something that is obviously put into question in cities that are destroyed by explosive weapons. Now, also the reference to wide area effects and categorized from has been improved, because in the previous text there was an ambiguous notion that can only be a possibility that this may have an effect, and if the weapons have a wide area effect. Peru is also very sensitive to the concerns raised by the ICRC this morning on the evidence that exists on the positive correlation between the use of explosive weapons with a wide area effect and the risk that civilians run in this situation. Now, in light of this positive correlation, Peru believes that the political declaration can recognize in the preambular part that the level of damage inflicted on civilians is directly correlated with the force of explosive devices. Finally, Ambassador, Peru sees this process as a recognition that hostilities more and more often are launched in populated areas, and we need to take action. And we have not seen in the text, and this is also not the spirit of this work that we're carrying out here, is to have a prohibition on certain types of weapon or the establishment of new international obligations. The political declaration focuses on political compromises and specific steps, all of them in line with IHL, with a view to only raise awareness and to promote change in policies and military tactics on the ground to protect civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Indonesia, to be followed by Finland. So Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. At the outset, Indonesia would like to commend Ireland for the second revised text on the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences that can arise from the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We would like to also commend your continued efforts in advancing the negotiation of the text in an inclusive and transparent manner, despite the challenges posed by COVID-19 pandemic. Indonesia places utmost importance on the protection of civilians and acknowledges that the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas often results in unacceptable levels of civilian harm. Therefore, we support the call for action to address the humanitarian impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. We are of the view that the political declaration should not be deemed as a reinterpretation of the international humanitarian law. Rather, it should serve as a reaffirmation of our collective commitment and obligations to fully implement the IHL and minimizing humanitarian consequences arising from the use of EWIPA. Indonesia also believes that this political declaration could serve as operational recommendations to concretize the principles set out in the IHL and to fill the gaps therein. In this context, Indonesia welcomes the improvement in the latest draft, including the deletions of certain qualifiers, which we view sends a stronger message on the gravity of humanitarian consequences of WIPA and the urgency of taking actions. We look forward to the deliberations throughout these consultations and reaffirm our support to this process. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Finland, to be followed by Pax. Finland, you have the floor.
Mr. Chair, as this is the first time my delegation is taking the floor, let us begin by thanking you, Mr. Chair, and your team for your hard work on the current draft political declaration. In addition to the EU statement delivered earlier today, we would like to make some remarks on our national capacity. These consultations do not take place in a vacuum, and it is important that we pay attention to what is currently happening in Europe. Finland strongly condemns Russia's military aggression on Ukraine. Russia's invasion is also an attack on the entire European security order. The attack is a flagrant violation of international law. Russia should cease attacks immediately. Finland supports negotiations for a political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas and from the beginning has taken actively and constructively part in it. We commend Ireland for a leadership and balanced approach. The draft declaration serves as a good basis for discussions. As a general remark, Finland views that focus should be on full and effective implementation of IHL. IHL is clear, but the implementation remains a problem. In short, there is no legal gap, but rather a gap in compliance. Moreover, focus should not be on specific weapons or weapon categories, but rather on their use, that is, compliance with IHL. Furthermore, it is of great importance to have a broad range of countries on board for the declaration to have a real impact in practice. On Section 1, we welcome the inclusion of the gendered impacts of explosive weapons in populated areas in the paragraph 1.7 bis. While acknowledging the importance of gender dimension, we would like to widen the scope and propose to amend the paragraph as follows. We also welcome work to empower and amplify the voices of all those affected, including women and girls, older people, and persons with disabilities, and we encourage further research into the impacts of the use of explosive weapons on persons in vulnerable situations. Mr. Chair, thank you once again and rest assured of Finland's full support in your demanding task. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor now to Pax, to be followed by the Minds Action Group. Pax, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Pax would like to thank Ireland for their leadership in this political process and commend Ireland for their draft text, which overall has been improved over time. As an INU member, we would like to refer to the INU commentary to reflect our full suggestions to further improve the text. On behalf of Pax, I would hereby like to reflect on the issue of wide area effects. There is no reference at all to wide area effects in the declaration text, and whilst the previous version of the text had too many references to explosive weapons with wide area effects, and as such narrowed the focus of the declaration too much, this central concept is now missing. This while the relationship between wide area effects and increased harm to civilians when used in populated areas is at the core of the civilian harm that this political declaration seeks to address. We would therefore like to see the concept being described in the preambular section and secondly reinserted in Article 3.3. Factors that cause wide area effects are a large blast or fragmentation radius, the use of multiple munitions, inaccuracy of delivery, or a combination of these factors. The impact on civilians and civilian objects of these wide area effects are well documented by PAX and by many others in Ukraine and other places such as Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, to name a few. Over and over again, civilians are killed, wounded, psychologically harmed, their homes, their schools, their hospitals destroyed, their environment harmed. The reverberating effects of explosive weapons in populated areas with wide area effects are grave and resonate for an extended period of time. The preambular paragraph should include a description that wide area effects present a direct and heightened risk of civilian harm, alongside a description of the factors that produce these effects. Such a statement in the preambular section would serve the purpose of the political declaration as a whole. The reference to wide area effects can then be reinserted in 3.3 without the need for further explanation or qualifiers there. The preamble should stipulate that these factors result in a significant likelihood that the effects of the weapon will extend beyond or occur outside the specific military objective in a populated area that puts people and infrastructure in that wider area at a significant risk of harm. In conclusion, a strong commitment in 3.3 against the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas will be central to the declaration. Adding a description of the factors that create wide area effects in Section 1 of the preamble, as well as the link to increased harm these inflict to civilians when used in populated areas, will promote understanding of what a commitment in 3.3 entails. This will also prevent the need for qualifiers in 3.3 that risk blurring the meaning of the central commitment and will facilitate understanding and implementation of this commitment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I will give the floor next to Minds Action Group, to be followed by the United States. Minds Action Group, you have the floor.
Chair. Allow me to start by congratulating you and your team for the excellent work done so far on this political process, including through these difficult 2 years of the pandemic. We see now that although it has taken longer than expected, with the conflict in Ukraine, the subject is sadly as relevant as ever. As a member of INU, MAG aligns itself with the INU statement, and we would like to add some remarks in our individual capacity. MAG conducts humanitarian mine action activities in a range of conflict-affected contexts, including Iraq, Syria, and Myanmar. Having witnessed both the immediate destruction resulting from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and the long-term barriers to reconstruction and development due to explosive ordnance contamination, MAG will share reflections and recommendations based on our experience and expertise. In the interest of time, I will deliver a shortened statement on Section 1, and I will submit in writing specific wording suggestions. In the preambular section, we welcome the stronger articulation of the impact of IWIPA, including the removal of descriptions throughout the text that use of explosive weapons in populated areas can cause harm, because evidence shows that they indeed do. What is missing from this section is an explanation of wide area effects. Weapons with wide area effects pose a particularly high threat to civilians and civilian infrastructure due to their last blast or fragmentation radius, use of multiple munitions, or lack of accuracy. Such weapons continue to pose a danger even when they do not detonate, and they should be avoided in populated areas. While we welcome the removal of repeated and unnecessary references to wide area effects throughout the text in the previous version, an explanation of these types of weapons should be included in the preamble, and the reference to them should be retained in paragraph 3.3 as already called for by several delegations. Therefore, we support an additional paragraph in this preambular section which describes weapons with wide area effects. MAG would also like to recommend more consistent use of language. Paragraph 1.4 references unexploded ordnance, and later on paragraph 3.5 references explosive remnants of war, which have different meanings. MAG recommends using the term explosive ordnance in both cases as a catch-all term that is used in the International Mine Action Standards. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor next to the United States, to be followed by Mexico and Chile for some more detailed comments. US, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm sorry to take the floor again, but we thought it was better to separate the initial remarks from the section-by-section discussion. Because strengthening the goal of the protection of civilians is our shared goal here. Everyone shares it. It's essential for Section 1 to present an accurate and a balanced picture of the risks to civilians and civilian objects during urban warfare and the causes of the harm to them. I'd note in this respect that there's a number of delegations who have suggested that you remove the word can in various places in Section 1. But doing that would actually tip the balance again. It would create imbalance here by giving the impression that the use of explosive weapons always causes civilian harm. The sources of civilian harm are much more complex and much more varied. And to be realistic, we have to reflect that. In this respect, it's also important for the declaration to make it clear that all belligerents, including non-state armed groups, must take steps to address the causes and risks to civilians and civilian objects. So we have some not extensive but important language proposals to make this clearer. Our primary concern with the text as you've presented it to us, Mr. Chair, is with the use of the term reverberating effects in section in paragraph 2 of this section. The term is also used in section 3, paragraph 4, and in section 4, paragraph 2. As our delegation and many other delegations have previously noted, our military forces take into account the reasonably expected risks of harm to civilians and other protected persons and objects during military operations, such as during planning and when conducting those military operations. For example, reasonably expected risks of harm are considered when commanders decide what precautions to implement when conducting attacks. However, under IHL, rather than focusing on general risk of harm to civilians, the prohibition on attacks expected to result in excessive collateral damage is implemented with respect to the expected loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. We have to keep that in mind. On the other hand, reverberating effects is a novel term, which is not reflected in existing IHL. Its meaning and scope of application are unclear and would be unclear in this declaration. As section 1.2 illustrates, the use of explosive weapons can result in harm to civilians beyond the direct effects resulting from an attack. And the risk of causing these indirect effects, including from damage to critical infrastructure, is important. And we agree that it should inform the planning and conduct of military operations. However, we are not prepared to accept in the declaration a novel term like reverberating effects, not found in IHL, and for which we don't have any common understanding or agreement on its scope of application. Many times when commanders are deciding between different courses of action, they must weigh complex sets of competing risks. For example, the risks of defeat or mission failure, the risks to their own forces or to other friendly forces, the risk to populations they are trying to protect from an adversary, and the risks of incidental harm to civilians. We should be mindful of all these risks that commanders have to weigh during military operations and not place undue emphasis on ones that may be quite attenuated from the military action to which they are attributed. We acknowledge that a number of groups and analysts are referring to reverberating effects, but the declaration must not imply that governments that sign on to this declaration are endorsing that term or how those individuals or entities might be arguing that it be applied. We recommend that the term reverberating effects be removed and replaced with the word indirect. This is even more important in the later operative parts of this declaration, specifically sections 3.4 and 4.2, but we'll discuss those later. In paragraph 1 of section 1, we would like to make some minor suggestions to make that section more balanced. First, we would propose replacing the word as at the beginning of that paragraph with the word when, and changing the verb tense from have increased to the present tense increase, which would make this declaration more universal and not detract from the purpose of that sentence. The sentence which would thus read, when armed conflicts become more protracted, complex, and urbanized, the risks to civilians increase. These slight tweaks would avoid the unsubstantiated implication that the risks to civilians have inevitably increased over time. The available data doesn't support the assertion that there's a greater number of civilian casualties today than in past conflicts. However, our delegation is very concerned about the number of civilian casualties in modern-day armed conflict. We recognize the demographic trends which indicate that greater concentrations of people are living in urban areas around the world, and we agree that the likelihood of civilian casualties increases when armed conflicts are protracted and urbanized. Second, we also propose an addition to the end of the second sentence of section 1.1 to emphasize that risks to civilians must be addressed by, quote, all belligerents. This would emphasize that non-state armed groups are also responsible for mitigating the risks to civilians. In section 1.5, paragraph 5 of section 1, we appreciate that the text acknowledges the policies and procedures that many responsible militaries have in place. This is a critical component of the declaration. However, we believe the first sentence should be modified to more closely reflect this type of military practice. We thus propose two changes in the first sentence. First, we must acknowledge that while responsible militaries seek to avoid civilian harm, they do so in the context of carrying out their operational requirements. Second, the reference to, quote, detailed understanding of anticipated effects is often an unrealistic standard. For the United States, our military practices are aimed at achieving the best understanding that is feasible under the circumstances. We thus propose that this first sentence read, quote, many militaries already implement policies and practices designed to avoid and in any event minimize civilian harm when carrying out their operational requirements, which include practices to obtain a better understanding of the anticipated effects of explosive weapons on a military target and its surrounding areas and the associated risk to civilians in populated areas. We also believe that there's an opportunity in this paragraph to strengthen the declaration. The second sentence could highlight that there is room for practical improvements to both achieve and also to exceed compliance with IHL. The sharing of military practices on protection of civilians is important, not only for IHL compliance, but also to support the protection of civilians even beyond legal standards, promoting a broad range of practical measures and establishing mechanisms for states to exchange practices could yield immediate and concrete results. As with all of our language proposals, we will submit those in writing. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me caution that it would be important not to reintroduce the concept of wide area effects into this declaration, even if it's with using different language. Doing so would roll back the improvements that we and many other delegations have perceived with this draft of the declaration. It's also important that the text not try to single out specific types of weapons using vague terms or factors. Again, these are not realistic. These aren't proposals that represent realistic ways that military forces make their decisions in carrying out their operational requirements. The issue is the compliance with IHL and how we use the weapons and carry out our operational policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those detailed comments, and absolutely no need to apologize for coming back a second time. We want this to be as interactive as possible, and I would encourage others, if within any section towards the end, at the end of it, there are some elements that have emerged that you wish to comment on, please put up your nameplate, because we want to hear as much reaction as possible throughout the consultations. So thank you for that, and I give the floor next to Mexico and Chile, to be followed by Israel. You have the floor, Mexico and Chile.
Mr. Chairperson, the delegations of Chile and Mexico have the following specific comments on Section 1. The title. We recognize the positive changes to the title, which highlights the core objective of the political declaration, the means and methods chosen to attack lawful targets in populated areas. The choice of weapons should be assessed in light of technical, military, legal, and policy considerations with a view to providing effective protection for civilian and civilian objects. We do not agree with the addition of indiscriminate use or unlawful use, as these uses are already prohibited by IHL. What would the purpose of this political declaration be? Section 1.1. We understand that there might be the need to have a first framing of the humanitarian issue of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas within the broader trend of urban armed conflicts. However, in our view, the main focus of the paragraph should be on the core objective of the declaration. Therefore, rather than just stating including the use of the WIPA in the first sentence, we propose a last sentence that states, one clear factor that has been identified to have humanitarian consequences is the use of explosive weapons, in particular with wide area effects in populated areas. In broader terms, to be factually correct, it should be clarified that not only the risks have increased, but also the actual humanitarian consequences, including the rates and proportions of civilian death and injured persons, as well as the indirect and reverberating effects. 1.2, in this paragraph, the use of the conditional can does not reflect in clear terms that explosive weapons, in particular with wide area effects, do have a devastating impact on civilians and civilian objects in populated area, as is shown by ample evidence. We would therefore suggest replacing the first sentence with the following. There is a strong likelihood that such use, in particular those of explosive weapons with wide area effects, will have direct and indirect, including reverberating, effects on civilians and civilian objects. In the second sentence, while we welcome the inclusion of blast and fragmentation as characteristics of direct effects, we consider that debris is more a byproduct of such effects and not a characteristic in itself. We welcome the comprehensive description of indirect effects that include elements of what has been described by our delegations as reverberating effects. Our delegations are not dead set in a particular terminology, as long as there is a recognition of the particular effects that extend beyond time and space, which damages and destroys the critical infrastructure and affects populated areas broadly and for a period that extends beyond the initial blast or fragmentation. These effects gravely affect the fulfillment of the basic needs, fundamental human rights, and the development goals of entire communities and even countries. In broader terms, we would suggest the streamlining of paragraphs 1.2, 1.3, and parts of 1.4 as follows. 1.2, the use of explosive weapons can have devastating impact on civilians and civilian objects in populated areas. Direct effects are those produced by blast and fragmentation that cause death and injuries, including lifelong disabilities, as well as destruction of housing, schools, and cultural properties. Beyond these direct effects, civilian populations are exposed to severe and long-lasting indirect effects, also referred to as reverberating effects, many of which stem from the damage to or destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, such as energy, food, water, and sanitation systems, and eventually from unexploded ordnances or explosive ordnances, as MAG has corrected just recently. These services are often interconnected, and as a result, damage to one of the components or services can negatively affect services elsewhere, causing harm to civilians that can extend far beyond a weapon's impact area. And 1.3, the direct and indirect effects result in psychosocial and psychological harm of civilian populations, impact the environment, leading to contamination of air, soil, water, and other resources, result in the displacement of people within and across borders, all of which erode the fulfillment of basic human rights and have a severe impact on progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Regarding paragraph 1.5, we welcome an acknowledgement that there are currently operational policies and practices designed to avoid and in any event minimize civilian harm on the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. However, we should be cautious not to overestimate how widespread these policies and practices are and how encompassing their scope actually is. Empirical evidence suggests otherwise, and this is the reason that justifies the urgent need of this political declaration. In other words, regardless of the implementation of operational practices designed to mitigate civilian harm, data suggests that unacceptable risk of civilian harm is still ongoing. Hence, the need to step up our efforts to effectively enhance compliance with IHL through a change of behavior through policy commitments. Lastly, while it is feasible to include in this introductory section a recognition of the existence of practices and policies in general terms, the issue of what constitute good practices to be implemented and sharing of such good practices would be better placed in the operative section. Regarding paragraph 1.6, we welcome this paragraph, but would suggest streamlining it with a broad acknowledgement of the importance of recording and tracking civilian casualties to fully understand the extent of the impact of explosive weapons on civilian population, the humanitarian consequences, which is key to inform policies to prevent and mitigate civilian harm. Along the same lines, we would suggest removing the caveat where feasible, which actually undermines transparency efforts in this regard. Conscious of what some delegations have described as legal impediments, we would suggest, as a minimum, to make every effort to share and make publicly available the relevant data, as transparency should be the general rule to avoid impunity, which can, in the long run, undermine the legitimacy of this political declaration. All other references to this paragraph would be better suited in the operative section of the declaration in order to effectively implement a specific political commitment in this regard. Regarding paragraph 1.7, we welcome the inclusion of language that refers to the imperative of addressing the short and long-term humanitarian consequences resulting from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. However, we believe that it would be better placed as a standalone paragraph after 1.4 or as the last paragraph of section 1. We welcome the changes to the text that recognizes the ongoing work of the United Nations, the ICRC, and civil society in its full extent, and not just limited to awareness raising, as was previously reflected. Regarding paragraph 1.7 bis, we are of the view that this paragraph could be more specific on what encompasses the gender dimension, taking into account the evidence-based findings which have been highlighted, for example, in the UNIDIR fact sheet in this regard. We would propose the following drafting, taking into consideration that the impacts of explosive weapons in populated areas vary among women, men, girls, and boys, the gendered implications of direct and indirect / reverberating effects should be acknowledged and considered in prevention and protection strategies. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Israel, to be followed by Belgium. Israel, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor again for our specific comments. Regarding paragraph 1.1, as mentioned by us as well as several other delegations, one main factor with respect to the risks posed to civilians in armed conflict is the conduct of non-state actors who deliberately conduct their operations from within populated areas while making use of human shields and similar tactics. In our view, it is important that the declaration addresses this conduct as well, as it results in the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Furthermore, we believe it is important to include a reference in this paragraph in order to tie it in with the condemnation of such tactics that appears in paragraph 2.4. Therefore, we suggest adding a relevant reference to this matter so that it would read, "The causes of these risks involve a range of factors, including the use of tactics intended to exploit the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to military objectives in populated areas," and so on. Additionally, we support the U.S. suggestion to add "by all belligerents" after the words "must be addressed," in order to acknowledge that this concern must be addressed by all parties, including non-state actors. Regarding paragraph 1.2, as already mentioned by many delegations, the term reverberating effects is not an agreed term among states. While the existing legal obligation is to consider reasonably expected deaths or injuries of civilians and damage to civilian objects, the use of the term reverberating effects originates from an attempt to promote a legal argument that all such effects must be considered in proportionality assessments. However, this term has been subject to substantial controversy among states and scholars, which was discussed, for instance, in the International Expert Meeting on the Principles of Proportionality organized by the ICRC in 2016. To this day, no agreement has been reached on this. Thus, we suggest omitting the term from the declaration. Furthermore, the term critical civilian infrastructure also does not currently enjoy an agreed meaning among states. The current text suggests how to define it for the first time in an international document, potentially triggering far-reaching implications. We suggest omitting this term and just using the term civilian infrastructure. Regarding paragraph 1.4, we suggest adding the word could before the word impede. This wording seems more accurate and is similar to the wording in the last draft. The text would therefore read, "Following the conduct of hostilities, unexploded ordnance could impede the return of displaced persons and cause casualties long after hostilities have ended." Regarding 1.5, we noticed that the word good before operational policies and practices in the first sentence was deleted in this version. We would suggest adding it in order to acknowledge that good practices already exist, as well as to match the references later in this paragraph regarding good practices. Furthermore, we suggest using the term incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, rather than civilian harm, and mitigating incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, rather than protecting civilians, in order to reflect more accurately existing IHL terminology. Regarding paragraph 1.6, firstly, we recognize the importance of appropriate data collecting and suggest adding a reference to collecting data regarding the exploitation of the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to military objectives, as such aspects are also significant and relevant element of urban warfare that can help inform policies and efforts by states to further the protection of civilians. Furthermore, here also we suggest using the phrase incidental loss to civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, rather than civilian harm and harm to civilians, in order to reflect more accurately existing IHL. Therefore, the paragraph would read, "Improve data on civilian casualties, including tactics of using human shields and other practices designed to exploit the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to military objectives in populated areas, would help to inform policies designed to avoid and in any event minimize incidental loss to civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, aid efforts to investigate, support efforts to determine or establish accountability, and enhance lessons learned processes in armed forces." We will submit all our comments in writing. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give the floor now to Belgium, to be followed by Colombia, but the representative of Belgium has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, since it is the first time my delegation takes the floor, allow me first to thank you and your team for leading our work not only today, but for the last couple of years. While COVID-19 made it difficult for us to meet during a prolonged period, current events unfortunately demonstrate once again the utmost importance of this topic. We would like to thank Ireland for leading consultations on this subject and drafting the political declaration circulated to us. Belgium aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and would like to make some additional remarks in its national capacity. Mr. Chair, before getting into specific comments on the draft political declaration, Belgium has to address the recent atrocities committed on European ground. My delegation condemns in the strongest terms Russia's military aggression against Ukraine in violation with international law. Belgium demands that Russia cease its military actions immediately and unconditionally withdraw its military forces from the entire territory of Ukraine and respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. Belgium calls on all actors in this conflict to comply with international law, including IHL. We also condemn the reported use of anti-personnel mines and cluster bombs, which are by nature indiscriminate weapons. Regarding the draft political declaration, my delegation would like to make the following general remarks. The scope of the political declaration has been significantly broadened by the suppression of the words with wide area effects throughout the text and in the title, so that the declaration now concerns all types of explosive weapons. Explosive weapons with wide area effects are those that are problematic ones in populated areas and should be the point of focus in this political declaration. Alternatively, and as already mentioned by some delegations such as Turkey, the Republic of Korea, and Canada, adding the word indiscriminate before use of EWIPA would, according to my delegation, correctly address the problem. While my delegation understands the underlying idea of reverberating effects and thanks inter alia UNIDIR for its study on the issue, this concept, as mentioned in paras 1.2, 3.4, and 4.2, does not exist as a legal concept under IHL, as already underlined by several delegations. This should therefore be clarified and/or defined in the political declaration. An alternative could be to change this wording by the word indirect or incidental. With regard to Section 1 in particular, Belgium would like to make the following remarks. The humanitarian consequences of the use of EWIPA are stated in a more affirmative manner by the deletion of the word can in the title and in different paras of the declaration. Belgium suggests to maintain as a minimum the word can in para 1.2 that addresses the long-lasting indirect effects of EWIPA, as not all uses of EWIPA lead to those effects, as well as in the chapeau of Part B, humanitarian consequences that can arise instead of arising. In para 1.2, education disruption has been inserted, although the destruction of schools is referred to only in para 1.3. To be consistent, the word schools should rather be moved from para 1.3 and added to the list of critical civilian infrastructures listed in para 1.2. My delegation welcomes also the adding of the word and universal implementation in para 1.5. It puts the focus on the states not complying or implementing their obligations under IHL. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor next to Colombia, to be followed by the Friends World Committee for Consultation. So, Colombia, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor embajador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'd like to begin my intervention by thanking you for all of your efforts and thank your team for the efforts over the last several months aimed at presenting this proposal to us that we see is getting better and better, and it will also help other states commit to the protection of civilians to join this very timely initiative. Over the last several weeks, we have seen countless images of how explosive devices were used in an indiscriminate manner against Ukraine that have affected civilians. The invasion and military aggression that included the bombing of schools and hospitals, as well as populated centers like the city of Mariupol, are grave violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and human rights of all of Ukrainians, and cannot remain unpunished. These events make this declaration more and more necessary, and it is important that our common objective here is to protect civilians in the context of armed conflict. Now, in line with their instructions, I'd like to refer to Section 1. First, we agree with different delegations that have recalled that this is an effort to protect civilians and not to restrict or prohibit the use of types of weapons that are acceptable under IHL. Also, I'd like to thank you for removing the term with wide area effect. For me, delegation, this term was not very clear and may lead to different interpretation that will be difficult to explain. In this section, I'd like to join the delegation of the United Kingdom and Israel that have said this morning or expressed their interest to have clear references to the use of explosive weapons by non-state actors. These types of organizations that continue to carry out action in areas that are usually populated are those that use these types of weapons in a discriminated manner that lead to damage that may be unacceptable to all of us. We also believe that declaration will be strengthened with a stronger condemnation of the actions of these actors. Now, on the reference to reverberating effects, something that we've seen throughout the document, my delegation believes that perhaps we would need a clear definition of the scope of this term. And even though we can share different interpretations of this term, my delegation believes that it should also be applied on the ground the greatest clarity, and this will be better for effective implementation. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the recognition that declaration makes on the different impact that these explosive weapons may have, something that we see in paragraph 1.7 bis. Thank you.
Very much. I give the floor now to the Friends World Committee for Consultation, to be followed by New Zealand. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We appreciate the invitation to comment on this draft, and we welcome the revised declaration. Our inputs will focus on strengthening the declaration's focus on the humanitarian consequences of explosive weapons and the complementarity of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We therefore welcome the change in the title from can arise to arising, which we suggest mainstreaming into the text and spirit to recognise that such consequences do arise from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And our comments on references to arms control, in particular, to emphasise that all weapons, legal, diverted and illicit, have a direct and indirect impact on civilians, therefore also encouraging a focus on explosive weapons impacts on all rights, not only the right to life. In particular, in Part A, Section 1, we would like to suggest the following in order to strengthen the declaration on its theme. Removal of the word can in 1.2 to change to has a devastating impact, in line with other delegations and civil society colleagues, as these do have such effects, and that should be stated clearly. At the end of 1.2, sentence far beyond a weapons impact area, to add the word direct for clarity, based on the distinction between direct and indirect in this paragraph, which would read, causing harms to civilians that can extend far beyond a weapon's direct impact area. In 1.3, we also align ourselves with WILF and the Conflict and Environment Observatory, who suggest a deletion of natural, as natural limits the scope, whereas environment recognizes natural and urbanized environment, where water and sanitation, as mentioned above in the paragraphs, is affected. Further, removal of the word can in line with the rationale stated above to read, and the environment is also impacted. For 1.4, we suggest an addition of a reference to the Sustaining Peace Agenda, which is impacted by the use of explosive weapons and is mutually reinforcing to the SDGs. This would read, and the Sustaining Peace Agenda adopted by the Security Council Resolution 2282 and General Assembly Resolution 7262. Based on paras 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, we suggest a new 1.5 preceding the existing 1.5 that recognizes that the facilitation of arms transfers is directly linked to the use of explosive weapons and the impacts outlined in paragraphs 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. The paragraph would read, the facilitation of arms transfers is directly linked to the use of explosive weapons, which impacts the protection of civilians and the full enjoyment and fulfillment of human rights. Human Rights Council Resolution 4120, and I quote, urges all states to refrain from transferring arms when they assess, in accordance with applicable national procedures and international obligations and standards, that there is a clear risk that such arms might be used in the commission or facilitation of serious violations or abuses of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law. And that is from operative paragraph 3. Further, in efforts to strengthen the protection of civilians arising from the use of explosive weapons, there is significant scope for states to take steps to refrain from arms transfers and commit to the implementation of other multilateral initiatives such as the Arms Trade Treaty. In 1.5, we suggest adding a line at the end that would further strengthen efforts to mitigate, avoid, and minimize civilian harm, which would read, further, recognizing that the facilitation of arms transfers is directly linked to the use of explosive weapons, there is scope for engagement of all actors to refrain from arms transfers and commit to instruments in the such as the Arms Trade Treaty to better protect civilians and prevent, mitigate, and avoid civilian harm. In 1.6, the use of all practicable measures to ensure appropriate data collection implies certain practices in data collection that can be harmful. There should be an addition in the sentence of in line with data protection or best practice. Finally, in 1.7 bis, we welcome the addition of gendered impacts to this declaration. However, we suggest rewording it to focus on the purpose of this paragraph in the following lines. The rewording would read, we also welcome work to address the gendered impact of the use of explosive weapons, and we encourage further research and developments on the gendered impacts of the use of explosive weapons. We will send updated proposals and exact language in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to New Zealand, to be followed by Austria. New Zealand, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, on behalf of the New Zealand delegation, I would like to extend our thanks and sincere gratitude to Ireland for its leadership and hard work in driving this process forward over the last 3 years, despite significant disruption the COVID pandemic has caused. Your updated draft as circulated is, in New Zealand's view, significantly improved. We are pleased to see that much of the conditionality in the earlier drafts has made way for clearer and more specific language. New Zealand is very supportive of this, and indeed, please let me extend our support to you, Mr. Chair, in this vital task. The political declaration has an important role to play in highlighting the significance of this issue and raising awareness of the particular characteristics and implications of the use of explosive weapons, with wide area effects in urban conflict. The powerful and affecting testimony we heard by video this morning from Nujeen Mustafa brought home these effects to us all and powerfully set out why we must achieve meaningful progress this week. As Finland noted, our efforts here are not happening in a vacuum. In this regard, New Zealand condemns Russia's recent illegal invasion of Ukraine and the human harm and material damage its military operations in urban areas have inflicted on the Ukrainian civilian population and civilian infrastructure, including through the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects. Russia's conduct is a stark reminder of why enhancing the protection of civilians in conflict zones is much needed. Aotearoa New Zealand encourages all delegations here today to focus on reaching agreement on the text so the declaration can be adopted, promoted, and implemented with the urgency it demands. It's time to get this political declaration done, and we are well poised to do so. Overall, the text is in a very good place, and we support the improvements to it put forward by Ireland in this latest draft. New Zealand has read carefully the excellent materials prepared by the ICRC and INU. We wish to state our appreciation for their inputs, in particular with respect to emphasising the significance of wide area effects, not as a qualifier, but as a descriptor that ensures our declaration remains firmly linked to the humanitarian consequences caused by these weapons. Taking on board the task set out by our Irish colleagues to make specific textual suggestions, we would like to turn now to offering some more following specific comments on Section 1 of the text. Firstly, in general, we support the removal of conditionality throughout the preamble. And more specifically on paragraph 1.1, we endorse the ICRC's proposal to include language that links explosive weapons, wide area effects, and the risk of civilian harm. Namely, this would be through a new sentence that reads, "These risks are exacerbated when the effects of such weapons are expected to extend beyond the military objective due to the weapon's explosive power or lack of accuracy or the number of munitions." On paragraph 1.2, we support ICRC proposals to include the phrase explosive weapons in populated areas and echo its points that it is civilians who overwhelmingly bear the brunt of these weapons' use. Also in regard to paragraph 1.2, we support additional language put forward by the ICRC on psychological and psychosocial harm to civilians, and would suggest this fits better in paragraph 1.2, not 1.3. We also support INU's proposal that we include the particular vulnerability of children in conflict zones. Finally, on this paragraph, we support INU's proposal that we explicitly refer to a lack of civilian access to humanitarian relief. This urgent need has again been brought into stark relief during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In paragraph 1.3, we note the point made by several delegations that hospitals be included in the first line, and we support this. On paragraph 1.4, we support the ICRC's proposal to refer to the severe consequences for health and livelihoods caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And our final point on section 1 relates to paragraph 1.5. New Zealand supports the ICRC's proposal that we reference the urgency of our work to reduce the unacceptable levels of civilian harm and to strengthen the protection of civilians in urban warfare. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I give the floor next to Austria, to be followed by Argentina. Austria, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the opportunity to share some more specific comments on section number 1. Overall, as mentioned in our opening remarks, the recognition of the risks posed to civilians and the actual and well-documented pattern of harm need to be more accurately reflected. In this regard, paragraph 1.1 continues to be rather general and would benefit from further focus on explosive weapons. We therefore suggest at the very end of the sentence to replace "and" by "which" and to add "in armed conflict" at the very end. So for the sentence to read, "The causes of these risks involve a range of factors, including the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which pose complex challenges for the protection of civilians in armed conflict." Other delegations have made suggestions to recognize in this paragraph the correlation between the size of the impact of the weapon, often referred to as wide area effects, and the likelihood of risks of humanitarian harm. Austria would welcome such a reference that clearly indicates that in populated areas, the potential humanitarian risks of an attack highly depends on the expected effects of the weapon used. The larger the impact area, the higher the risks of humanitarian harm. On 1.2, we appreciate that this second paragraph focuses on the humanitarian concern, which is the raison d'être of our efforts. This morning, we heard again from many stakeholders on the ground, including in the UN interagency statement delivered by UN OCHA, as well as from the ICRC, about their experiences and the well-documented impact of explosive weapons use. Certainly, paragraph 1.2 is setting the scene of why states need to take action. Based on the facts on the ground, we need to be more assertive. So we would suggest that the paragraph reads as following: the use of explosive weapons has devastating impact on civilian and civilian objects in populated areas. Also, just a couple of minutes ago, the delegations of Mexico and Chile suggested a solution reflecting the factual evidence of increased risks and humanitarian consequences, which would also be a possible solution. Still, on 1.2, we appreciate the more descriptive language that has been chosen to describe the indirect and reverberating effects. This certainly makes the political declaration more readable and accessible. To further enhance clarity, we would like to suggest an editorial comment in the fourth sentence, so for it to read: when critical civilian infrastructure, such as energy, food, water, and sanitation systems, is damaged or destroyed, the fulfillment of basic needs and the provision of essential services, such as healthcare and education, is disrupted. Mr. Chair, as some delegations have raised concern about mentioning reverberating effects, I would like to recall that this concept has been widely used when referring to the humanitarian harm caused by explosive weapons use in populated areas, including in a number of UN reports. The reverberating effect have been a key notion in our deliberations over the years. They encapsulate the recognition of the broader impact scope of explosive weapons when used in populated areas as a main source of risks of civilian harm. Certainly, for my delegation, it is important to keep reverberating effects in the declaration, and we believe the descriptive wording used in this Ref 2 should provide sufficient clarity. This clarity will also be important during the implementation phase of our political declaration. Mr. Chair, the delegation of Togo has made an important point about including impediments to humanitarian access caused by VIPA. We are flexible on the placement, but we certainly believe that there is a clear evidence of this concern, especially when the wide area effects have effectively disconnected parts of cities. Paragraph 1.2 or 1.3 could be options to reflect these impediments to humanitarian access. On paragraph 1.6, data collection is indeed a sensitive area, but it is also a crucial area to monitor progress on the implementation of IHL. While we would have appreciated a more ambitious approach, the current drafting, which in our perspective captures all views expressed during the last couple of years, indeed provides a very balanced compromise. To conclude, we appreciate the opportunity to provide comments in writing. Nevertheless, and in the same vein as New Zealand just before us, my delegation would like to encourage others to make the best use of the fact that we can indeed unite in person. We should make the best use of these 3 days by trying to take the opportunity to find an agreement on these paragraphs as we go along. And Norway this morning made an important point about restraint, which we would like to echo. Given the urgent need to take action, it is important to finalize this declaration to allow the political level to endorse the declaration and to start working on its implementation. I thank you.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Argentina, to be followed by France. Argentina, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor. Thank you very much, Chair. Since it's the first time my delegation is taking the floor, would like to thank you and thank your team for the leadership that you have shown during the entire process with a view of adopting a political declaration that will help us strengthen the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. My delegation would like to join those delegations that thanked you for the funding provided to ensure that we have interpretation during these meetings and to ensure that we preserve multilingualism. This new draft has improvements in comparison to the previous versions. It is concise and clear, and it can indeed have an impact not just amongst experts, but also for the public at large. And the first part of the document, as a sponsor of the document on safe schools that has been supported by 114 countries, my delegation notes with great pleasure the reference made in 1.3 to schools, and also we agree with the delegations of Austria and Uruguay and others with the need to add in 1.3 a reference to hospitals or health services. And as has been mentioned by Article 36 NGO, we would prefer that we have a reference here not just to destruction, but also any damage that may be inflicted on civilian infrastructure, for example, homes, schools, and hospitals. We also welcome the inclusion and recognition of the reverberating effects that civilian populations are exposed after the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We also would like to support the suggestion made by the distinguished delegation of Panama to replace the word sex by the word gender in paragraph 1.6 when we talk about disaggregated data. Now, the suggestion to add expressions like can or could in paragraphs that make a reference to the effects that these weapons have on civilians and displaced civilians. For example, paragraphs 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. My delegation would like to prefer the use of such caveats and to the greatest possible extent, because there are numerous studies that have shown that in the last decade, civilians suffered from 90% of the damage caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Now, in conclusion, I would like to express our support in your efforts aimed at the adoption of a political declaration. We believe that the timeliness of such a declaration is more than ever important, especially in light of the most recent effects, as we see on a daily basis the devastating impact of explosive weapons on civilians and civilian infrastructure, both in Ukraine and other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to France, to be followed by Italy. France, you have the floor.
Merci. Thank you very much, sir. I have asked for the floor again, this time in order to give my delegation's comments on section 1 of your draft revised declaration. Now, I'd like to say that this is a section that we like overall. We have no major problems. You've done excellent work, we believe. And you've certainly taken into account our concerns, in particular during the previous negotiation round, and we would like to thank you for this. I think that at this stage in our discussion, we can, of course, continue at length in our discussions, but the risk would be that we'd have an ad infinitum debate. I think you've managed to strike a good balance, a satisfactory balance for the delegations present here, though I don't wish to speak in their stead. But just one comment on 1.1. And this is an extremely important paragraph, I believe, because we mustn't leave out any of the subjects of concern to us. And one of the areas of concern is the illegal and deliberate use of explosive weapons against civilian populations in violation of IHL on purpose. And we've heard from Ukraine this morning. And if we don't raise this issue in this section 1, if we don't raise this problem, I think we would really be missing out on what we want to say. Now, I think that what we could do is draw on a resolution adopted in the General Assembly recently on the 21st of March 2022 on humanitarian results of the aggression against Ukraine. There are two preambular paragraphs, 8 and 11, in this statement, which could be of use and which do refer specifically to the use, illegal use of explosive weapons against civilians, infrastructure, convoys, hospitals, schools, critical infrastructure in violation of international humanitarian law. And my delegation will be giving you language, but once again, the idea really is to improve the text and make clear the terms of the debate and what we want to do. Apart from that, as I've said, Section 1 is overall satisfactory to us, and I will take the liberty of taking the floor on other sections of the text later. Thank you, sir.
Merci. And I give the floor now to Italy, to be followed by Uruguay and then the ICRC again. But Italy, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to add a very brief remark on the issue of wide area effects. We share the view that the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas poses higher risks of civilian harm. It is quite clear that different types of explosive weapons have different impact on civilians, and we think this should be subject to different operational considerations in accordance with international humanitarian law. So we believe that this element should be reflected in the declaration in Section 1 and or in Section 3. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Uruguay, to be followed by the ICRC. Uruguay, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor embajador, por...
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for giving me the floor once again. I will take the liberty of making a brief comment on Section 1. Once again, it seems to us that it would be useful to have a restructuring of 1.2 and 1.3 in order to ensure greater consistency and make it clear how these are relevant in terms of their impact on civilians. For example, I'm not sure whether we want to use Roman numerals, but I think it might be appropriate to organize the information as follows in English.
Impact on civilians and civilian objects in populated areas. Y allí,
and in this way, we would have letter A and we'd say
lifelong disability. Y aquí traeríamos del 1.
And here we would add part 3.
Psychological and psychosocial harm to civilians. En lo que sería el B.
In B, we would say, we'd respond.
Civilian populations are exposed to several and long-lasting indirect effects to the end, and we would also like to see the first sentence from 1.3 moved to the end of this section. The destruction of housing, schools, and cultural heritage sites further aggravates civilian suffering. Lo siguiente sería la referencia.
Then we would have the reference to environmental effects,
leading to contamination, etc. Y por último,
and then finally, a reference to D.
Of civilians and have a severe impact on progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. And then here, the reference to the possible deaths caused by unexploded ordnance. All of estas sugerencias, perdón, son simples.
These suggestions are designed simply to give information and make it clearer what the priorities are, referring first of all what we think of as being the most important, and then we'd have a text that would be easier for the public at large to read. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to the ICRC.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to quickly make 2 points following various suggestions that we heard this afternoon. We heard several delegations raising questions on terms such as reverberating effects or civilian harm, suggesting to modify these terms in Section 1 on the ground that they would not be existing concepts under international humanitarian law. I'm not discussing here what is relevant incidental civilian harm under international humanitarian law for the purpose of the application of the rules on proportionality or precaution, nor what the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks entail. I simply wanted to draw the attention of the distinguished delegation that this first section of the draft political declaration is on the humanitarian consequences of the use of explosive weapons in populated area, not on the law. These consequences, of course, encompass relevant incidental civilian harm as understood under IHL. But civilian suffering or civilian harm is suffering or harm regardless of the manner in which it is or is not considered by IHL. Furthermore, harm not considered under IHL may well be considered under political commitment, which is also a key part of this declaration. So we would encourage states to keep a broad scope in this Section 1 under the understanding that this section is not meant to necessarily reflect the law, but rather that its purpose is to recognize the suffering that the use of explosive weapons in populated area cause for civilians. Let me turn to my second point. A few delegations have suggested to reintroduce the word can or could in various parts of this first section, from which it has been deleted in the current draft compared to the previous draft. The deletion of these words is, in our view, an important improvement of the current draft. We believe the current draft appropriately reflects the reality of today's conflict. To illustrate this, let me just say that I didn't hear, neither in this room nor outside, of examples of conflicts where explosive weapons were used in populated area and caused no unexploded ordnance. I didn't hear either of situations where unexploded ordnance had no effect on the speed or extent of the return of displaced person or on their safety. In our experience, these sentences without this qualifier therefore do reflect the reality of the consequences for civilians of the use of explosive weapons, and we therefore recommend that such qualifiers are not reintroduced where they were deleted. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now that is, the ICRC was the last speaker on our list. I just want to check around the room. Are there any more interventions on Section 1, just at this stage before we move on? I don't see any, but then I want to thank you very much for this. This is exactly how we want to proceed with the debate, not just statements, but suggestions and reactions. And I think we've heard a lot today on Section 1, and we have a lot of suggestions, and we have a lot of language proposals. So I would just ask that those who have put in language proposals, if you could, as quickly as possible, submit them to us to the usual Geneva Consultations email. But it just would be very helpful to us to keep the momentum going if the suggestions that you've made in this last session, you could, as quickly as possible, submit them to us, because I'm not sure that we have got every single detail and we want to hear them from you. So thank you very much for that. That has been extremely useful. Section 1, and I think we can immediately move on to Part A, Section 2. And I think the really important thing first to say about this section, which I've said before, but I think is really important to emphasize, that it's not the intention with this section to reinterpret applicable international law or to create any new legal standards or obligations. I know that's a point that we've made, but it's the first point I would make again. This section of the draft declaration sets out to recall the existing obligations and commitments under applicable international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Additionally, paragraph 2.1 focuses on accountability, with the draft reaffirming our commitment to end impunity. Paragraph 2.2 is particularly important as it explicitly reaffirms the existing international humanitarian law provides the legal framework to regulate the conduct of armed conflicts and is applicable to the use of explosive weapons in all operating environments. Section 2.3 recalls the IHL obligation to distinguish between combatants and civilians, as well as between military objectives and civilian objects. The prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions. And it recalls the IHL obligation to provide civilians with general protection against dangers arising from military operations. Section 2.4, which was moved from Section 1.5, focuses on tactics designed to exploit the proximity of civilians, the use of IEDs to target civilians, and it highlights the role of non-state armed groups. This section has been strengthened considerably to include a condemnation of such tactics. And the text also makes clear that IHL rules apply to all parties to armed conflict. Finally, the new draft retains a reference to the UN Security Council resolutions on the protection of civilians, but removes the direct numbered references. So with that short summary of what is a relatively short but very important section, I would open the floor again for comments and proposals explicitly on this section 2. So I'll open the floor, and I see Turkey, I think. Yes, Turkey, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. As we said earlier, the political declaration shouldn't set additional standards beyond the existing obligations determined by international conventions to which states are parties. So we propose 2.1 as follows. We urge states to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, in particular their obligations under the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols thereto of 1977 as applicable, to ensure the protection of civilians from humanitarian harm during armed conflict, including urban warfare. Accordingly, we propose that the statements in the draft text in 2.2 and 2.5 regarding compliance with international humanitarian law be changed to compliance with obligations under international humanitarian law agreements to which states are parties. In 2.3, their commitments under have to be added before international humanitarian law. Mr. Ambassador, I would like to voice our understanding and concern on the term of non-state armed groups or non-state actors. The term of so-called non-state armed groups is an ambiguous term and could be misinterpreted or misused. It doesn't make any differentiation among other actors and terrorist organizations. Therefore, we are strongly against any engagement with terrorist groups by misusing and exploiting the very nature of this term. It goes without saying, terrorist organizations cannot be considered as a party to any armed conflicts. Within this context, the political declaration should not pave the way for terrorist groups to use populated areas as safe havens for their heinous acts. In 2.2, the term all parties to an armed conflict would suffice. including both state and non-state armed groups, should be deleted. We propose to change the wording at 2.4, non-state armed groups, to non-state parties to an armed conflict. We would also like the following sentence. The notion of parties to an armed conflict cannot be used for terrorist organizations, to be added. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I give the floor now to Franz.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, sir. On Section 2, just as on Section 1, we are again globally satisfied by the work, so thank you once again. We do nonetheless have a proposal to make on 2.4. 2.4 is a very important paragraph in the present context of the armed aggression by Russia in Ukraine. We think that this is a para, 2.4, needs to be strengthened because it deals with condemnations. We do need to condemn methods of war that are unacceptable, unbearable, and a regression, a moral regression. Now, in order to do this, we think, as in Section 1, that we could draw on language which was adopted in the General Assembly, which initially was put forward by France and Mexico in the Security Council and then transferred to the General Assembly. So I'll read it. It'll be simpler. In 2.4, we could add.
En anglais, we also strongly condemn any attacks directed against civilians as such and other protected persons and civilian objects, comma, as well as indiscriminate shelling and the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons, comma, and we further express concerns about the long-term risk posed by damage to civilian infrastructure and unexploded ordnance to the civilian population. Voilà, donc
So here, once again, this is language that was voted on and endorsed by the General Assembly, and I think that in the present circumstances, it is important to introduce this strong concept of condemnation. Now, another detail in 2.3, fourth line, in order to be more consistent with the language used in international humanitarian law, operations should be replaced by attacks. Thank you, sir. And we'll give you these proposals in writing, of course.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Next on the list is Pax, to be followed by Sweden. Pax, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. INU is generally positive about the way references to international law have, through the different versions of the text, found their way to be presented in a clear and separate section of the text. Section 2 reaffirms states' obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law and enumerates several especially relevant rules. Nevertheless, on behalf of the International Network on Explosive Weapons, I would like to provide some suggestions to further improve Section 2 of Part A. 2.1. This paragraph could additionally state the duty to conduct investigations into possible violations of international humanitarian law. Such investigations are an essential part of the process that leads to accountability and an end to impunity. The text would then read, we affirm our obligations and commitments under applicable international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, comma, including our obligations to conduct investigations into possible violations of international law, text continues, and hold accountable those responsible for violations, and our commitment to end impunity. At 2.2, the reference at the end of the paragraph to "in particular within populated areas" should be removed, as the obligation to protect civilians and civilian objects is applicable in all circumstances. On 2.3, the text has been improved with the inclusion of a reference to the legal obligation to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. We recommend adding a reference to humanitarian passage for civilians to be safe, however. Because the passage of relief is often subject to geographic and temporal constraints and not sustained, we also recommend emphasizing the need for broader assistance in the form of sustained humanitarian access and humanitarian operations. We therefore propose the following language for 2.3. We also recall the obligation under international humanitarian law to provide civilians with general protection against dangers arising from military operations and to allow and facilitate, insert safe, continue, rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, comma, insert, as well as to facilitate sustained humanitarian access and operations. On 2.4, moving this paragraph on violations of international law from the section 1 to the preamble's legal section is appropriate. It allows the section 1 to focus on issues of civilian harm from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, recognizing civilian experience of suffering and harm regardless of the legality of the attacks. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Sweden, to be followed by Japan. Sweden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. We're mainly happy with Section 2 as it's currently drafted. We do have one comment on paragraph 2.4, which is a bit in line with what the distinguished ambassador of France just said. Since this paragraph is a single paragraph in the declarations, which contains a condemnation of a certain action, we do believe that it should also include a condemnation of targeted attacks towards civilians and civilian objects, in line with paragraph 4.1 in the earlier draft WIPA declaration from 2020. So we therefore suggest that paragraph 2.4 starts by the following wording. We condemn the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian objects, tactics designed to exploit the proximity of civilians and or civilian objects, and so forth. We'll submit our proposal in writing as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Japan, and Japan will be followed by Wilf. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. We have a specific comment with regard to paragraph 2.3. Although we could understand the contextual intent of this paragraph, we have some difficulty to understand the meaning of the words disproportionate attacks in this paragraph. The words don't have an established definition or usage in international laws. Accordingly, we would like to propose to change the words to excessive attack, as this term is used in Article 57, paragraph 2, Roman 3 of Geneva Additional Protocol 1. By doing so, we believe that this paragraph should become much easier to interpret and more acceptable for many countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Wilf, to be followed by Human Rights Watch. Wilf, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Wolf supports the comments made just now by Ainu, and we also wanted to quickly suggest one addition, which is that this section only recognizes international human rights law very briefly and focuses almost exclusively on international humanitarian law. So we'd like to suggest that a new paragraph could be added that specifies that states continue to have obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights during armed conflict, and must exercise due diligence when using explosive weapons and must assess their human rights impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the next and final speaker for now is Human Rights Watch. So I give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Chairman. Section 2, the Political Declarations legal section, provides an opportunity to address some of the legal issues related to this document. Some states have expressed concern that the political declaration will create new law. It does not, and in fact cannot, since it is a non-binding policy document. But a political declaration that simply restates and calls for compliance with existing law has no added value. As the title indicates, the purpose of the declaration is to strengthen the protection of civilians. The chapeau of the operative section specifies that the goal should be achieved by commitments that both strengthen compliance with international humanitarian law and address the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The two parts of the preamble reflect these two interrelated ways to advance protection of civilians. Section 2 includes restatements and reaffirmations of relevant international legal obligations, whose compliance should be strengthened. Such provisions are common elements of political declarations. They ground the document in law, giving the document added weight, but they cannot be read in isolation. Section 1, as already discussed, outlines the fundamental problem that the commitments must also address. That is, humanitarian consequences of explosive weapons in populated areas, whether direct or reverberating effects. On a related note, I would also like to specifically address the contention of some states that the political declaration should focus on the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas. Narrowing the subject of the declaration in this way would distract from the larger humanitarian issue and reduce the instrument's effectiveness. An emphasis on indiscriminate use is problematic on multiple fronts. First, indiscriminate use is already unlawful under international humanitarian law, and thus a declaration dedicated to it would add little to existing legal protections. Second, directing commitments exclusively at the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas implies that other use is acceptable. Evidence shows, however, that the use of explosive weapons, especially with wide area effects in populated areas, causes a foreseeable pattern of harm, regardless of the practice's legality. Finally, the concept of indiscriminate use can become politicized because it draws on legal determinations states make about their opponents, including non-state armed groups. A political declaration should instead deal broadly with the humanitarian consequences associated with the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The declaration should adopt policy commitments that respond comprehensively to the foreseeable harm that motivated states to begin the process towards a new instrument. Promoting compliance with international humanitarian law is part of the solution, but not all of it. The declaration should enhance the protection of civilians from the range of adverse impacts, not just the effects of indiscriminate use. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have now Germany to be followed by Switzerland. So Germany, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman. I would like to support the French proposal to insert language from the United Nations General Assembly resolution on humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine in paragraph 2.4. However, given the gravity of the violation of IHL when directing attacks against civilians as such, this part of the French proposal should actually open the paragraph in my delegation's view. So that would read, 2.4, we strongly condemn any attacks directed against civilians as such or other protected persons and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate shelling and the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons. And it would then continue, we also condemn tactics designed to exploit the proximity and so on. In this sentence, we would propose to insert to exploit the unlawful, to unlawfully exploit the proximity of civilians. The declaration we are negotiating today and the following days should consist in a strong commitment from all of us to better protection of civilians. But it should also include a clear call on all parties to armed conflict, also those not present today, to respect IHL and the humanitarian principles and to fully comply with their IHL obligations when using explosive weapons in order to minimize civilian harm. While recognizing states' responsibility to protect civilians, we should also adequately reflect the role and the responsibility of non-state actors. To that effect, we propose the following amendment to paragraph 2.1. Add after international human rights law, we condemn the blatant disregard for these binding rules witnessed in incidents in recent conflicts, both by state and non-state actors, and reaffirm the obligation to hold accountable those responsible for violations and our commitment to end impunity. In paragraph 2.2, we suggest to add and universal before compliance with international humanitarian law, as this has been done already in section 1. So the second sentence would read, we stress the importance of full and universal compliance with international humanitarian law as a means to protect civilians and civilian objects, and so on. Finally, in paragraph 2.3, we suggest that we add after combatants in line 3 the word fighters, so that it would read, we recall the obligations on all parties to armed conflict to comply with international humanitarian law under all circumstances, including when conducting hostilities in populated areas, and recall in particular the obligation to distinguish between combatants/fighters and civilians, as well as between civilian objects and military objects, and so on. We will revert to our other amendments on other sections that could strengthen this message during the exchange on these sections. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I give the floor next to Switzerland and following that to the United States. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In section 2, the declaration recalls our obligations and commitments under international law, and we generally welcome the text. As IHL provides the legal framework for the protection of civilians, including in populated areas, this section is of particular importance. It is also essential that the language used in this section is precise. With regard to paragraph 2.1, we would support to include wording referencing the duty to investigate already in section 2. We would just suggest to consider including a commitment highlighting the importance of establishing the facts in cases of alleged violations. Paragraph 1.7 mentions the importance of investigating harm. We believe this should also be reflected in the operational part here and in section 4 of the declaration. We are happy to provide concrete language in written. With regard to paragraph 2.4, IHL sets out a clear set of binding rules that need to be respected by all parties to a conflict in all circumstances. Amongst these rules is the prohibition of the use of human shields, which requires an intentional collocation of military objectives and civilians or persons hors de combat with the specific intent of trying to shield military objectives from attacks, or to shield, favor, or impede military operations, or in other words, to render them immune from attacks. IHL also requires that parties to the conflict shall, to the maximum extent feasible, avoid locating military objectives within or near densely populated areas. It is violations of these rules and other violations of IHL, like direct attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as have been mentioned by other delegations, which should be condemned. That said, we should be careful not to create new norms and make sure that our condemnations are aligned with the existing prohibitions under IHL. This aspect should be reflected in the political declarations For instance, by speaking of unlawful tactics, and we remain also open to see other solutions. Let me also say a word on suggestions to limit the declaration on indiscriminate or unlawful uses. In our view, the focus of the text should not lie only on the indiscriminate use of explosive weapons in populated areas. While this is a clear violation of IHL, the obligations of IHL go further than just prohibiting indiscriminate attacks. For instance, we would highlight the obligation that parties to an armed conflict must take constant care to spare the civilians and civilian objects in military operations. Moreover, all feasible precautions must be taken in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding and in an event to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to the United States, to be followed by Austria and then the United Kingdom. US, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As others have said, Section 2 sets out existing IHL requirements related to the protection of civilians and civilian objects during armed conflict. Many of my delegation's edits to Section 2 are relatively technical in nature, with the goal of ensuring that Section 2 accurately reflects IHL. In addition, some of the edits we are proposing are intended to accommodate the legal obligations of the widest range of states, rather than only states that are parties to the 1977 Additional Protocol 1. We think that edits should be made that accommodate states that are not parties to the Additional Protocol without prejudicing the views or legal obligations of states that are. So we hope the declaration can be drafted in a way that allows states with different treaty obligations to sign on. In the first paragraph of Section 2, Mr. Chair, we read the purpose of this paragraph to be the reaffirmation of states' respective legal obligations under IHL and international humanitarian rights, international human rights law as applicable. The U.S. delegation does not object to a reaffirmation of related commitments, but the language should be clear that related commitments are not law. This could be fixed by removing the reference to commitments, which now reads, we reaffirm our obligations and commitments under applicable IHL, under applicable international law. We would remove the reference to commitments and reorder the sentence to make clear that related commitments are separate from obligations under applicable international law. So the sentence could read, and I quote, we reaffirm our obligations under applicable international law and related commitments, particularly IHL and IHRL, including our obligations to hold accountable those responsible for violations and our commitment to end impunity. We also recommend that Section 2.1 refer to obligations plural rather than obligations singular, given that there are different specific obligations with respect to accountability for a state's own forces and for others within one's jurisdiction. In paragraph 2, Mr. Chair, the first sentence should be modified to make clear that existing IHL regulates the use of explosive weapons, just like all other weapons, to conduct and defend against attacks. So we would add that language, to conduct and defend against attacks, after the words explosive weapons and before the words in all operating environments. There are no specific obligations in IHL restricting the use of explosive weapons as such, as the sentence currently could imply. Second, and similar to the edit we suggested in Section 1, we think it's important to refer to the protection of civilians and civilian objects and the avoidance or mitigation of harm within the context of, quote, carrying out operational requirements, unquote. This would better reflect the reality that military forces are routinely seeking to avoid or otherwise minimize civilian harm in the context of armed conflict, which also has certain operational imperatives rather than merely in the abstract. So the reference to carrying out their operational requirements would replace the words conducting hostilities in paragraph 2.2. In paragraph 2.3, Mr. Chairman, we believe the first sentence of that paragraph should more accurately reflect existing IHL obligations applicable to all states, not just to parties to AP1. For example, operations, as the word is used here, should not be conflated with attacks, as operations can be conducted more broadly than attacks, such as evacuations or providing warnings to civilians. And civilians in such operations are not military objectives. So the text that we would propose would be to say in the fourth line after military objectives, to say, and conduct attacks only against military objectives. And the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take feasible precautions in attack and when subject to attack. The last clause of this first sentence would be modified to reflect passive precautions more accurately. Passive precautions are those taken by forces subject to attack to reduce the risk of harm to protected persons and objects from the effects of enemy attacks, such as by refraining from placing military objectives in densely populated areas or by removing civilians and civilian objects from the vicinity of military objectives, rather than merely the efforts made to protect against attacks. So the reference there would be to add, let's see, then the U.S. delegation is also concerned about the second sentence of paragraph 3. As written, the text seems to be derived from Article 51.1 of AP1, but it's framed as an affirmative obligation to provide protection for civilians, rather than as a general acknowledgement of the legal protections afforded to civilians during military operations, such as through the various list of prohibitions and restrictions reflected in the other paragraphs of Article 51. For legal clarity, we think this can be easily fixed with some minor edits. So the changes then to that, to the second sentence of paragraph 2.3 would say, we also recall the obligations under international humanitarian law related to the general protection of civilians against the dangers arising from military operations. The last clause of that sentence should also be revised to read, and the importance of allowing and facilitating rapid and unhindered passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, so as to promote the practice of quickly getting relief to where it needs to go, rather than seeming to make it a statement of IHL, which we think would need considerable refinement to be accurate. Thus, we would propose that the entire sentence read as follows. We also recall the obligations under IHL related to the general protection of civilians against dangers arising from military operations, and the importance of allowing and facilitating rapid and unhindered passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. For paragraph 4 of section 2, we thank you, Mr. Chairman, for adding this section, moving the provision from section 1, which highlights the use of tactics, including by non-state armed groups, designed to exploit the proximity of civilians and military objectives in populated areas, such as the use of human shields, and which significantly increase the humanitarian risks to those civilians. In my delegation's view, Section 2.4 should also include the requirement of passive precautions. Specifically, that belligerents take feasible precautions to help protect the civilian population and civilian objects under their control against the effects of attacks. So what we would propose is to add, after the words populated areas in the second line of paragraph 4, add the words, and endorse the requirement that belligerents take feasible precautions to help protect the civilian population and civilian objects under their control against the effects of attacks. Then end the sentence there and start the next idea with a new sentence and say, we also condemn the use of improvised explosive devices, and so on. Finally, in section 2.4, so paragraph 4, I'm sorry, after paragraph 4 of 2.4, we would propose adding a new 2.4 bis before we get to paragraph 5. And in a way, Mr. Chairman, some of our proposal here is similar to the proposals made by France and seconded by Germany, and also referenced by Sweden, to reflect the current situation in Ukraine, although that's not why we initially had conceived of this. The U.S. delegation continues to believe that this declaration should paint an accurate and balanced picture of the use of explosive weapons during armed conflict, which is a standard and lawful military practice if used consistent with IHL. In some cases, explosive ordnance is used to protect civilians during armed conflict or to promote critical humanitarian objectives. It is the unlawful and irresponsible use of such weapons that this declaration is intended to address, not the lawful uses of weapons during armed conflict. So the new text that we would propose as a new paragraph 4 bis would say, while explosive weapons are a legitimate means of warfare under IHL, the use of which may be required by military necessity, we condemn the unlawful or irresponsible use of such weapons, which can cause significant harm to civilians. And we think, Mr. Chairman, that some additional language, such as that initially proposed by France, seconded by Germany, could also fit in this section. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, we have 2 more speakers on the list now, and 2 more speakers at least who have asked could they come back on this subject first thing tomorrow morning. So I think what we will do is we will stop here and we will resume in the morning at 10 o'clock and pick up this section 2 in order to finalize it. And if anyone else in the room wishes to come back on section 2, they can do so tomorrow morning first thing. And then just to let you know for, and we beg your indulgence on this, for logistical reasons, we have to slightly reverse the order of what we're going to do after section 2. So when we complete section 2 tomorrow, we move to part B, the operative section, and we will start with section 4, and we will go through section 4 before then moving to section 3. I know that's not exactly as you would expect, but I hope that will be okay for everyone. And I know there will be plenty to say on both. So I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you very, very much for your engagement, for your positive, productive engagement today, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Have a very good evening, everyone. Thank you very much.